The lecture hall buzzed with the usual pre-class chatter of the Galactic Military Academy's Advanced Strategic Warfare course. Commander Zethkar adjusted his ceremonial battle harness, the metal plates catching the artificial light as he surveyed the mixed-species classroom. As a decorated Vorthak warrior with 3 successful planetary campaigns under his belt, he commanded respect wherever he went. His reptilian features bore the ritual scars of his homeworld's warrior caste, and his massive frame towered over most other species in the Academy. The course was considered one of the most challenging in the entire Galactic Federation military curriculum. Only the brightest tactical minds from across known space earned seats in Professor Velteron's classroom. Today's lesson would focus on the historic Battle of Kepler's Edge, where a vastly outnumbered Federation fleet had somehow managed to defeat a technologically superior enemy force. Zethkar's eyes scanned the room until they settled on the human sitting 3 rows ahead. Sarah Chun looked unremarkable by any military standard. She was small, even by human standards, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. No visible scars, no intimidating presence, nothing that screamed warrior. The human wore the standard Academy uniform without any special decorations or rank insignia that would indicate combat experience. The Vorthak commander had heard rumors about humans since they joined the Galactic Federation 5 years ago. Some claimed they possessed unusual tactical abilities, while others dismissed them as another weak species that had somehow stumbled into space travel. Looking at Sarah Chun, Zethkar found himself firmly in the second camp. How could such a fragile-looking creature possibly understand the complexities of interstellar warfare? Professor Velteron, a tall and elegant Altarian with silver skin that seemed to shimmer with each movement, called the class to attention. His species was known throughout the galaxy for their analytical minds and had produced some of the Federation's finest military strategists over the past millennium. Today we examine the Battle of Kepler's Edge, Professor Velteron announced, his voice carrying easily through the amphitheater-style classroom. The year was 2387, and Admiral Karash led a Federation task force of 47 vessels against the hegemony's invasion fleet of over 200 ships. The enemy possessed superior firepower, better armor, and more advanced propulsion systems. By all logical calculations, the Federation force should have been completely destroyed within the first hour of engagement. The professor activated the holographic display that dominated the front of the classroom. A 3-dimensional representation of the Kepler system materialized, showing the positions of both fleets at the battle's beginning. Red dots represented hegemony forces, while blue dots showed Federation ships. The difference in numbers was immediately obvious to everyone present. Instead, Professor Velteron continued, Admiral Karash achieved what many consider the most decisive victory in Federation naval history. The hegemony fleet was not merely defeated but completely annihilated, with only 12 enemy vessels managing to retreat from the battlefield. Federation losses were minimal, with only 6 ships destroyed and 3 requiring major repairs. Zethkar leaned forward in his seat, genuinely interested despite having studied this battle extensively during his own military training. The tactical situation had always fascinated him, though he suspected the victory had more to do with luck and hegemony over confidence than any particular brilliance on Admiral Karash's part. Now then, Professor Velteron said, his pale eyes surveying the classroom. Who can explain how such an unlikely victory was achieved? What tactical principles did Admiral Karash employ to overcome such overwhelming odds? Several hands shot up immediately. Zethkar raised his own massive arm, confident in his analysis of the battle. He had written extensively about this engagement during his advanced officer training and believed he understood the key factors that led to Federation success. To his surprise, Professor Velteron's gaze passed over all the raised hands and settled on the human who had not volunteered to speak. Miss Chun, perhaps you could share your thoughts on Admiral Karash's strategy? Sarah Chun looked up from her notes with what appeared to be mild surprise. I'm sorry, Professor, but I think there might be some confusion about the battle data. A few students chuckled quietly at what they assumed was a human attempting to avoid answering a difficult question. Zethkar felt his confidence grow. Here was proof that humans were out of their depth in serious military discussions. Confusion? Professor Velteron asked, one eyebrow raising slightly. "Please elaborate." Sarah stood up, her movements precise and unhurried. The standard historical account contains several significant inaccuracies that make it difficult to properly analyze Admiral Karash's tactics. If we're working with incorrect data, any strategic assessment becomes meaningless. The classroom fell completely silent. Challenging the accepted historical record of one of the Federation's greatest victories was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. Professor Velterun was known for his meticulous research and had literally written the textbook they were all using. Zethkar could barely contain his amusement. This small human was about to embarrass herself in front of the entire class, and one of the galaxy's most respected military historians. He decided to speed up the process. "With respect," Zethkar said, rising to his full impressive height, "the Battle of Kepler's Edge is one of the most thoroughly documented engagements in military history. The Federation archives contain sensor logs from dozens of ships, survivor interviews, and even captured hegemony data cores. What possible inaccuracies could you be referring to?" Sarah turned to face him, and Zethkar was struck by how calm she appeared. Most students would be intimidated by his size and reputation, but the human showed no signs of nervousness or hesitation. "The fundamental error," Sarah said, "is in the initial fleet composition numbers. The standard account claims Admiral Karash commanded 47 Federation vessels, but this figure includes 12 supply ships and 6 medical frigates that were not combat capable. The actual fighting force consisted of 29 warships. Even so," Zethkar pressed, 29 against 200 is still an impossible tactical situation. The numbers don't change the basic strategic reality." Sarah's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested she was just getting started. "The hegemony fleet composition is even more problematic. The 200-ship figure includes 38 troop transports, 44 landing craft, and 57 escort vessels that were essentially armed cargo haulers. The actual hegemony battle line consisted of 61 heavy cruisers and destroyers." Professor Velterun had been listening with growing interest, and now he activated his personal data pad to cross-reference Sarah's claims. After a few moments of rapid searching, his expression shifted to one of surprise. "Remarkable," the professor murmured. "Miss Chen appears to be correct about the fleet compositions. The archived sensor data does support her numbers when properly categorized by vessel capability rather than simple ship count." Zethkar felt his first twinge of uncertainty, but he pressed forward. "Very well. The numbers were inflated for dramatic effect. But 61 heavy warships against 29 is still overwhelming odds. Admiral Karash's victory remains inexplicable by conventional tactical analysis." "Actually," Sarah continued, "that's where the next major inaccuracy appears. The battle didn't last 6 hours as commonly reported. According to synchronized chronometer data from multiple Federation vessels, the entire engagement was over in 43 minutes. Now the entire classroom was paying attention. Even Professor Velterun was actively checking his references, his silver features showing increasing fascination with Sarah's analysis. "But the most significant error," Sarah said, "concerns Admiral Karash himself. The historical records consistently refer to him as a brilliant tactical innovator who developed revolutionary new strategies during the battle. This is completely wrong." Zethkar saw his opportunity. "Are you seriously suggesting that Admiral Karash wasn't responsible for the Federation's greatest naval victory? The man is considered one of the finest strategic minds in galactic history." Sarah finally showed the first hint of emotion, a slight smile that somehow made Zethkar feel less confident rather than more. Admiral Karash was indeed present at the Battle of Kepler's Edge. However, he was unconscious in the medical bay after suffering severe injuries during a hegemony surprise attack on the command ship 12 minutes before the main engagement began. The classroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Professor Velterun was now frantically searching through archived medical reports, his academic curiosity completely engaged. "According to the medical logs," Sarah continued calmly, "Admiral Karash suffered a severe concussion and was sedated for surgery throughout the entire battle. He regained consciousness 6 hours after the engagement ended, which explains why his own after-action reports were based entirely on briefings from his staff rather than personal observation. Then, who commanded the Federation fleet? Asked a Centauri student from the back row. The tactical decisions were made by the officer who assumed command when Admiral Karash was incapacitated, Sarah replied. Lieutenant Commander Maria Santos, the Admiral's human aide-de-camp. Zethkar felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, but his warrior pride demanded he continue the challenge. Even if that's true, you still haven't explained how a vastly outnumbered Federation force achieved such a decisive victory. Tactics matter more than who's giving the orders. Sarah's smile grew slightly wider. That's where the analysis becomes interesting. Lieutenant Commander Santos didn't use conventional tactical doctrine at all. She ignored every standard Federation engagement protocol and instead employed what her personal logs describe as asymmetric harassment patterns based on historical Earth naval warfare. Earth naval warfare? Zethkar scoffed. You mean primitive ocean vessels? What could ancient human naval tactics possibly teach modern space warfare? Quite a lot, actually, Sarah replied. Santos used a modified version of tactics developed by human naval commanders during Earth's Second World War, specifically the submarine warfare strategies employed in the Pacific theater. Instead of engaging in direct ship-to-ship combat, she ordered the Federation fleet to break formation and attack in small, independent groups using hit-and-run tactics. Professor Velteron looked up from his data pad, his expression showing genuine amazement. Miss Chen, these records you're referencing, where exactly did you find them? My research staff has been studying this battle for over a decade. Human military archives, Sarah said simply. When Earth joined the Federation, we submitted complete historical records of all our military engagements, including detailed personal logs from human officers serving in Federation forces. Most species found our historical documentation too primitive to be worth serious study, so the records were stored in secondary databases. You're telling us, Zethkar said slowly, that the greatest victory in Federation naval history was won using Stone Age human tactics that everyone else ignored. Not Stone Age, Sarah corrected. World War II era, which occurred roughly 400 years before humans achieved spaceflight. And, yes, Lieutenant Commander Santos adapted submarine warfare principles to three-dimensional space combat with remarkable effectiveness. Professor Velteron was now completely absorbed in cross-referencing data from multiple sources. The holographic display updated as he accessed new information, showing a very different picture of the battle than the one presented in standard histories. Fascinating, he murmured. The pattern of Federation ship movements does indeed resemble submarine wolf-pack tactics when viewed from this perspective. Small groups of vessels using sensor shadows and asteroid fields for concealment, striking at isolated enemy units, and withdrawing before the main hegemony force could respond effectively. Zethkar stared at the updated tactical display, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The traditional narrative of a heroic fleet engagement was being replaced by something that looked more like guerrilla warfare in space. The hegemony fleet was designed for conventional line-of-battle tactics, Sarah continued. Their heavy cruisers were powerful, but slow to maneuver. When faced with highly mobile enemy units that refused to engage in direct combat, they couldn't bring their superior firepower to bear effectively. Santos kept them off balance for the entire engagement, picking off isolated vessels while avoiding the main enemy formation. But the casualty reports, protested a Tellarite student. The hegemony lost almost their entire fleet. How could hit-and-run tactics achieve such decisive results? Sarah accessed her own data pad and projected additional information onto the classroom display. The key was psychological as much as tactical. Hegemony doctrine emphasized overwhelming force and direct confrontation. When the Federation fleet refused to fight according to expected patterns, the enemy commanders became increasingly frustrated and began making tactical errors. The display now showed detailed movement patterns for both fleets throughout the engagement. The hegemony formation gradually disintegrated as ships broke off to pursue individual Federation units, leaving themselves vulnerable to coordinated attacks from multiple directions. 26 minutes into the battle, Sarah continued, the hegemony flagship attempted to chase down what appeared to be a crippled Federation destroyer. Instead, The destroyer led them into a carefully prepared ambush where 8 Federation vessels were waiting in the sensor shadow of a large asteroid. The flagship was destroyed along with its escort group, and hegemony command structure collapsed. Professor Velteron nodded slowly as he absorbed the new data. The remaining enemy vessels found themselves scattered across the system with no central coordination and facing an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. Panic set in, and their formation completely fell apart. Zethkar sank back into his seat. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. Everything he thought he knew about one of military history's most famous battles was wrong. But more disturbing was the realization that a human officer using primitive Earth tactics had achieved something that none of the galaxy's most advanced military minds had been able to duplicate in the centuries since. Miss Chun, Professor Velteron said, "This research is absolutely groundbreaking. Have you considered submitting it for publication in the Journal of Galactic Military History?" Sarah shrugged modestly. "I was just curious about the discrepancies I noticed when comparing official Federation records with human archives. It seemed like the kind of thing that might come up in class discussion." The casual way she dismissed what was clearly months of intensive research made Zethkar feel even smaller. This human had just rewritten military history as if it were a minor homework assignment. "There is one more thing," Sarah added, almost as an afterthought. "The tactics Lieutenant Commander Santos used weren't actually her own invention. She adapted them from strategies developed by her great-grandfather, who served as a submarine commander during Earth's Pacific War. The Santos family maintained detailed records of his tactical innovations, which Maria studied extensively before joining the Federation Navy." The implications hit Zethkar like a plasma torpedo. Not only had humans possessed advanced tactical knowledge for centuries before joining the galactic community, but they had maintained and studied their military history in ways that other species had never bothered to explore. Professor Velteron was already making notes for what would clearly become a major revision of his textbook. "Class, this is an excellent example of why we must always question accepted historical narratives and seek primary sources rather than relying on second-hand accounts." As other students began asking Sarah detailed questions about her research methodology, Zethkar remained silent. He had entered this classroom confident in his superior understanding of military strategy, ready to demonstrate why warrior species like the Vorthak were naturally better suited for command positions than soft species like humans. Instead, he had just witnessed a human casually dismantle one of the most famous military victories in galactic history and reveal tactical innovations that made the greatest Federation admirals look like amateurs. The small, quiet human who had seemed so unremarkable was clearly operating on an entirely different level of strategic understanding. Sarah answered each question with the same calm precision she had shown throughout her presentation, displaying a depth of knowledge that became more impressive with each detail she provided. She had clearly spent considerable time not just studying the battle, but understanding the broader context of human military evolution and how it applied to space warfare. As the class session drew to a close, Professor Velteron announced that next week's discussion would focus on Sarah's research and its implications for modern tactical doctrine. Several students were already requesting access to her source materials for their own projects. Zethkar gathered his materials in silence, his mind still reeling from what he had witnessed. He had challenged what he thought was an easy target and instead encountered something that completely shattered his assumptions about human capabilities. The warrior culture that had shaped his entire worldview suddenly seemed inadequate in the face of human strategic thinking. As students filed out of the classroom, Sarah remained behind to discuss additional research sources with Professor Velteron. Zethkar found himself pausing near the door, torn between wounded pride and genuine curiosity about what other human military innovations might be hidden in those neglected archives. The human had not just defeated him in academic discussion. She had done something far worse. She had forced him to question everything he thought he knew about military excellence and tactical superiority. The comfortable certainties that had guided his entire career were suddenly open to doubt. Walking back to his quarters, Zethkar realized that his real education was just beginning. The galaxy was far more complex than Vorthak warrior culture had prepared him to understand, and Humans possessed capabilities that none of the other species had bothered to investigate seriously. The question now was whether his pride would allow him to learn from someone he had so badly underestimated, or whether he would retreat into familiar certainties and miss the opportunity to truly understand what made humans such effective military partners. Sarah Chun had just taught him the most important lesson of his military career, though he was only beginning to realize it. The battle for Kepler's Edge was over, but the war for understanding had just begun. Commander Zethkar spent the next 3 days in his quarters, obsessively reviewing everything he could find about human military history. What began as wounded pride and a desire to find flaws in Sarah Chen's research had evolved into something approaching fascination. The more he dug into human archives, the more disturbing patterns he discovered. The Galactic Federation's military database contained detailed records of every member species' combat capabilities, technological developments, and strategic doctrines. The human section was remarkably brief, focusing primarily on their recent integration into Federation forces and their basic ship designs. Nothing in the official records suggested that humans possessed any particular tactical advantages. However, the raw historical data that Sarah had mentioned told a completely different story. Humans had been fighting wars continuously for their entire recorded history, developing and refining combat strategies across every possible environment and technological level. While other species had evolved beyond warfare or achieved peace through various means, humans had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of conflict. What made it worse was that the Federation military establishment had completely ignored this wealth of experience. When humans joined 5 years ago, the integration process had focused on bringing them up to current galactic standards rather than examining what they might contribute. Their primitive technology was dismissed, their tactical records were filed away, and their officers were quietly shuffled into support roles. Zethkar pulled up service records for human officers currently serving in Federation forces. The pattern was consistent across all branches. Humans held positions as logistics coordinators, communication specialists, and administrative support staff. Very few had been given actual combat commands, and none served in senior strategic positions. Sarah Chun herself was listed as a logistics planning student with high marks in theoretical studies, but no command experience. Her academic record showed exceptional performance in supply chain management, resource allocation, and operational planning, but nothing that suggested the kind of strategic brilliance she had demonstrated in class. A chime from his door interrupted his research. "Come," Zethkar called, expecting one of his fellow Vorthack students who often sought his advice on combat tactics. Instead, Sarah Chin stepped into his quarters, carrying a data pad and looking slightly hesitant. "Commander Zethkar? I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." The Vorthack warrior felt his embarrassment returning in full force. Being visited by the human who had so thoroughly demolished his confidence was the last thing he needed right now. "Miss Chun, what can I do for you?" "I wanted to apologize," Sarah said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "I didn't mean to embarrass you in class. Professor Velterun suggested I should have been more diplomatic about presenting my research." Zethkar stared at her in genuine confusion. "You're apologizing to me? For being correct about historical facts?" Sarah shifted uncomfortably. "I could have presented the information differently. Maybe shared my findings with Professor Velterun privately instead of challenging the accepted narrative in front of everyone. I know that Vorthack culture places great importance on honor and respect, and I may have inadvertently violated those principles." The fact that this human had taken the time to research Vorthack cultural values just to make sure she hadn't offended him was somehow more humbling than the original classroom incident. "Miss Chun, you have nothing to apologize for. Your research was thorough, your conclusions were accurate, and your presentation was professional. If anything, I owe you an apology for my presumptuous attitude." "Not necessary," Sarah replied quickly. "But I did want to ask you something. You mentioned that you've studied the Battle of Kepler's Edge extensively. I'd be curious to hear your analysis of Lieutenant Commander Santos's tactical decisions from a Vorthack perspective." Zethkar found himself in the strange position of having his military expertise genuinely solicited by someone who clearly knew far more about the subject than he did. From a traditional Vorthack viewpoint, Santos's approach would be considered cowardly. We value direct confrontation and honorable combat. Hit-and-run tactics are seen as the methods of weak species who lack the courage to face their enemies properly. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. That's an interesting cultural perspective. How do you personally view those tactics now that you've seen their effectiveness? The question forced Zethkar to confront the cognitive dissonance that had been troubling him for days. I'm beginning to realize that my cultural conditioning may have blinded me to tactical possibilities. The results speak for themselves. Santos achieved a decisive victory with minimal losses. From a purely strategic standpoint, her methods were superior to any conventional approach. But you're struggling with the cultural implications, Sarah observed. Precisely. Vordhak military doctrine is built around concepts of honor, courage, and direct confrontation. If human tactical methods are genuinely superior, it calls into question fundamental assumptions about what makes a good warrior. Sarah was quiet for a moment, apparently considering her response carefully. May I share something from human military philosophy that might help reconcile those concepts? Zethkar gestured for her to continue. One of our most respected military theorists, a general named Sun Tzu, wrote that supreme excellence is achieving victory without fighting. The highest form of warfare is defeating your enemy's strategy, not just their army. From that perspective, Santos didn't avoid honorable combat. She elevated combat to a higher level where victory was achieved through superior strategy rather than superior force. The reframing was elegant and somehow made the tactical approach seem less like cowardice and more like advanced martial arts. This Sun Tzu, was he the strategist who developed the submarine warfare tactics? Sarah smiled. Actually, Sun Tzu lived about 2,500 years before submarines were invented. His work, The Art of War, influenced military thinking for centuries and provided the philosophical foundation for many later tactical developments. 2,500 years, Zethkar repeated slowly. How long have humans been studying warfare systematically? Continuously for at least 5,000 years, possibly longer. Sun Tzu codified strategies that were already ancient when he wrote them down. Every human culture developed its own military traditions, and we've been cross-pollinating tactical ideas since the beginning of recorded history. The implications were staggering. While most galactic species had achieved peace or focused on other pursuits, humans had spent millennia refining the science of conflict. No wonder their tactical innovations seemed so advanced. They had literally thousands of years more experience than anyone else. Miss Chun, Zethkar said carefully, are there other human officers in the Federation military who possess similar strategic knowledge? Pretty much all of them, Sarah replied matter-of-factly. Military history is a core requirement in human education systems. Every human officer has studied historical campaigns, tactical evolution, and strategic theory from childhood. It's just basic cultural knowledge for us. Zethkar felt his worldview shift again. Sarah wasn't some exceptional genius who had stumbled upon forgotten knowledge. She was simply a typical human officer with standard human military education. The casual way she discussed revolutionary tactical concepts suggested that for humans, this level of strategic sophistication was completely normal. Why haven't human officers shared this knowledge with Federation military command? He asked. Sarah's expression became more guarded. Have you looked at human officer assignments in Federation forces? Zethkar nodded grimly. Logistics, communications, administration. No combat commands. When humans first joined the Federation, our military representatives tried to share our tactical knowledge and historical experience. The response was less than enthusiastic. Most species considered our methods primitive or irrelevant to modern space warfare. After a few polite rejections, human officers learned to focus on areas where their contributions were more welcome. But the Battle of Kepler's Edge proves that human tactics are highly effective in space combat, Zethkar protested. The Battle of Kepler's Edge was won by a human officer who was forced to take command in an emergency situation, Sarah corrected. She didn't have permission to implement human tactical doctrine. She just did what worked. Afterward, when the victory was attributed to Admiral Korash, nobody bothered to examine what had actually happened. The systematic exclusion of humans from meaningful military roles was starting to look less like bureaucratic oversight and more like willful blindness. The Federation had access to the most experienced military culture in known space, and was using them to manage supply inventories. Miss Chun, what would happen if human tactical knowledge were properly integrated into Federation military doctrine? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing her response. That's not really my place to speculate about, Commander. I'm just a logistics student. But her hesitation suggested she had thought about exactly that question, probably in considerable detail. Zethkar pressed gently. Hypothetically, then, what do you think would change? Hypothetically, Sarah said slowly, I think the Federation would need to completely rethink how it approaches military conflict. Human tactical doctrine emphasizes flexibility, deception, asymmetric warfare, and psychological operations. Most Federation strategies assume that enemies will behave rationally and follow predictable patterns. Human approaches are designed to work against opponents who are trying to outsmart you. Give me an example. Sarah activated her data pad and projected a star chart showing current Federation border defenses. These fortified positions are designed to repel direct invasion attempts using overwhelming defensive firepower. They're very effective against conventional assault strategies. But vulnerable to human tactics? Human doctrine would approach this completely differently. Instead of trying to punch through the defenses, we would focus on making the defensive positions irrelevant. Cut supply lines, disrupt communications, force the defenders to abandon their prepared positions by threatening targets they can't afford to lose. Make them come to us on our terms rather than attacking them where they're strongest. The tactical thinking was completely alien to Vorthak military culture, but undeniably sophisticated. These strategies would be effective against current Federation enemies? More than effective. Most galactic species have militaries designed for defensive operations or territorial control. They're not prepared for opponents who ignore traditional battlefield logic and focus on systemic vulnerabilities instead of tactical ones. Zethkar found himself imagining how Federation conflicts might unfold if human strategic principles were properly applied. The results would likely be swift and decisive, with enemy forces finding themselves unable to adapt to completely unexpected tactical approaches. Miss Chun, I need to ask you something directly. How many human officers in Federation service possess this level of tactical knowledge? All of them, Sarah replied simply. This is basic military education for us. What I've shown you isn't advanced strategy. It's the equivalent of elementary mathematics. Human officers with actual command experience would be operating at levels of sophistication that I can barely comprehend. The revelation was both exciting and terrifying. The Federation military was sitting on a strategic gold mine and treating it like filing clerks. Somewhere in the logistics core and communications divisions were human officers who could probably revolutionize galactic warfare if anyone bothered to ask them. Why are you sharing this with me? Zethkar asked. You could have simply apologized and left. Sarah's expression became more serious. Because I think you're someone who cares more about truth than pride. That's rare in any species, but especially valuable in military officers. The Federation is going to face serious external threats eventually. When that happens, we'll need leaders who can recognize and adapt to new tactical realities rather than clinging to traditional approaches. The compliment was unexpected and somehow more meaningful coming from someone whose strategic abilities he was beginning to truly appreciate. What kind of external threats? Unknown ones, by definition. But human military philosophy assumes that any conflict worth fighting will involve opponents who are smarter, stronger, or more numerous than you are. Otherwise, diplomacy would have resolved the situation already. Federation military doctrine seems to assume that overwhelming technological superiority will be sufficient to handle any threat. You don't agree? I think technological superiority is a temporary advantage at best. Real military strength comes from organizational flexibility, strategic innovation, and the ability to adapt faster than your opponents. Technology can be copied or countered. Superior decision-making is much harder to replicate. Zethkar was beginning to understand why human officers had been quietly shuffled into support roles. Their way of thinking about military problems was so fundamentally different from galactic norms that it probably made traditional military leaders deeply uncomfortable. Miss Chun, hypothetically speaking, How would you restructure Federation military organization to take advantage of human tactical knowledge? Sarah smiled grimly. Hypothetically, I would start by identifying human officers with actual combat experience and giving them command positions where they could implement human tactical doctrine. Then, I would establish cross-training programs to teach other species officers human strategic principles. Finally, I would completely overhaul Federation military planning to incorporate asymmetric warfare capabilities. The resistance to such changes would be enormous, Zethkar observed. Absolutely. Most galactic military establishments have institutional cultures built around current tactical doctrines. Admitting that human approaches might be superior would require senior officers to acknowledge that their entire career advancement was based on obsolete strategic thinking. The political implications were staggering. Sarah was essentially describing a complete revolution in how the Federation approached military affairs. The human integration that everyone thought was complete would actually require dismantling and rebuilding the entire military command structure. But it would be worth it, Zethkar said quietly. If the alternative is losing a major war because our tactical doctrine couldn't adapt to new threats, then, yes, it would definitely be worth it. They sat in silence for several moments while Zethkar processed everything he had learned. His understanding of military excellence, human capabilities, and Federation strategic doctrine had been fundamentally altered in the space of a single conversation. Miss Chun, he said finally, would you be willing to continue these discussions? I think I have a great deal to learn about human military philosophy. Sarah nodded slowly. I'd be happy to share what I know. But I should warn you, once you really understand how humans think about warfare, you won't be able to look at current Federation military policies the same way again. Perhaps, Zethkar replied. That's exactly what needs to happen. As Sarah gathered her materials to leave, Zethkar realized that his military education was about to begin all over again. The comfortable certainties of Vorthak warrior culture were giving way to a much more complex and sophisticated understanding of strategic reality. The human who had initially seemed so unremarkable was turning out to be a gateway into an entirely different way of thinking about conflict, strategy, and military excellence. The question now was whether the Federation's military establishment was ready for such a fundamental shift in perspective, or whether it would take a major crisis to force the necessary changes. 2 weeks later, Zethkar found himself in the Academy's secure briefing room at 0600 hours, waiting for what Sarah had cryptically described as an educational opportunity. The early morning timing and classified location suggested this was more than just another informal discussion about military theory. The door slid open to admit Sarah along with 3 other humans he didn't recognize. The newcomers wore standard Federation uniforms, but something about their bearing immediately marked them as different from typical Academy personnel. They moved with the quiet confidence of people who had seen actual combat, and their eyes constantly scanned the room in the automatic threat assessment pattern that veteran soldiers never lost. Commander Zethkar, Sarah said, I'd like you to meet some colleagues who were interested in our discussions about human military philosophy. The first human stepped forward, a weathered woman with graying hair and the kind of surgical scars that came from real battlefield injuries. Commander Martinez, Federation Logistics Corps, currently assigned to supply chain management for the Outer Rim sectors. The second was a younger man with alert eyes and the lean build of someone who stayed in combat-ready condition. Lieutenant Parker, Communications Division. I handle encrypted data protocols for classified transmissions. The third human was older, with the quietly authoritative presence that suggested senior command experience despite his lack of visible rank insignia. Colonel Santos. Yes, that's Santos. Lieutenant Commander Maria Santos was my daughter. Zethkar felt his assumptions shifting once again. These weren't just random human officers. They were carefully selected individuals with direct connections to the military innovations he'd been studying. I'm honored to meet you all, but I have to ask why you're here. Colonel Santos activated a privacy screen that blocked electronic surveillance before answering. Because Sarah tells us you're asking the right questions about Federation military preparedness. And because we think you're someone who might be able to help address some serious problems that are developing. What kind of problems? Commander Martinez pulled up a holographic display showing Federation border regions. Intelligence reports indicate increased activity from 3 different hostile factions along our frontier zones. The official assessment from Federation Military Command is that current defensive measures are adequate to handle any potential threats. You disagree? We think Federation Military Command is preparing to fight the last war instead of the next one, Lieutenant Parker said bluntly. The enemy factions have been studying Federation tactics for years. They know exactly how we respond to various threat scenarios, and they're developing countermeasures specifically designed to exploit our doctrinal weaknesses. Colonel Santos gestured to specific regions on the display. Look at these attack patterns from the past year. 3 separate incidents where small hostile forces penetrated Federation defenses, accomplished their objectives, and withdrew before our response forces could engage effectively. Zethkar studied the tactical data and gradually began to see what the humans were pointing out. They're using hit and run tactics, similar to what your daughter employed at Kepler's Edge. Exactly. They've learned from our own military history and are applying human tactical principles against us. Meanwhile, Federation Military Command continues to prepare for conventional fleet engagements that these enemies have no intention of fighting. Sarah added additional data to the display, showing Federation military response protocols. Our standard doctrine assumes that enemy forces will attempt to hold territory or engage in direct confrontation. When faced with opponents who strike quickly and disappear, our response becomes slow and ineffective. The irony, Commander Martinez said grimly, is that we have human officers throughout Federation forces who could easily counter these tactics. But they're assigned to logistics and communications instead of tactical planning positions. Zethkar was beginning to understand why this meeting was taking place in a secure briefing room. You're suggesting that Federation Military Command is vulnerable to exactly the kind of warfare that humans specialize in. But the expertise needed to address this vulnerability is being systematically ignored. Not just ignored, Colonel Santos corrected. Actively suppressed. Human officers who have tried to share relevant tactical knowledge have been transferred to different departments or given administrative duties that keep them away from strategic planning. Lieutenant Parker brought up personnel records showing the career paths of human officers who had attempted to contribute tactical insights. The pattern was consistent. Initial assignments to support roles, followed by transfers away from any position where they might influence actual military policy. This is deliberate, Zethkar asked. Not necessarily, Sarah replied. But the Federation military establishment has institutional biases that make it very difficult for unconventional ideas to gain acceptance. Human tactical approaches challenge fundamental assumptions about how warfare should be conducted. Commander Martinez nodded grimly. Most galactic species achieved peace through technological superiority, diplomatic solutions, or by simply avoiding conflict. The idea that warfare might be a complex discipline requiring specialized knowledge and constant innovation is alien to their thinking, which leaves the Federation unprepared for opponents who view conflict as a serious intellectual challenge, Colonel Santos concluded. We're about to face enemies who have spent years studying how to beat us, while our own military leadership refuses to learn from the most experienced warrior culture in known space. The implications were staggering. The Federation was essentially defenseless against any opponent sophisticated enough to employ human tactical doctrine, despite having access to thousands of human officers with exactly the knowledge needed to address such threats. What exactly are you proposing? Zethkar asked. We want to establish an unofficial training program for Federation officers who are willing to learn human military principles, Sarah explained. Start small, with individuals who have demonstrated intellectual flexibility and genuine interest in tactical innovation. And you think I'm such an individual? You were willing to abandon your preconceptions when presented with evidence that contradicted them, Colonel Santos observed. That's rarer than you might think among military officers of any species. Lieutenant Parker activated another display showing the current composition of Federation Military Academy classes. Most students here will graduate and take command positions throughout Federation forces. If we can introduce human tactical thinking to even a small percentage of them, it could make a significant difference in overall military effectiveness. But this would have to be done carefully, Commander Martinez warned. Official channels have already proven resistant to human military concepts. Attempting to force change through formal procedures would likely result in the entire program being shut down. Zethkar found himself being drawn into what was essentially a conspiracy to improve Federation military capabilities through unofficial means. The irony was not lost on him that the most important military education he might ever receive would have to be conducted in secret. What would this training involve? Historical analysis, tactical problem-solving exercises, strategic planning scenarios, and practical applications of human military philosophy, Sarah replied. We would start with basic concepts and gradually work up to more advanced principles. Colonel Santos leaned forward. More importantly, we would teach you how to think like human military strategists. Not just specific tactics, but the underlying cognitive approaches that make human warfare doctrine so effective. The goal, Commander Martinez added, would be to create a cadre of Federation officers who could recognize and counter unconventional threats, regardless of their specific nature. Lieutenant Parker brought up a training schedule that looked remarkably comprehensive. We've been developing this curriculum for months, waiting for the right opportunity to implement it. Recent intelligence reports suggest we may not have much time before these theoretical concerns become very practical problems. Zethkar studied the faces around the table. These were clearly serious military professionals who had identified a genuine strategic vulnerability and were willing to take personal risks to address it. The fact that they had to do so through unofficial channels said disturbing things about Federation military bureaucracy. If I agree to participate, he said carefully, what would be expected of me afterward? Eventually, we hope you would help identify other officers with the intellectual flexibility to benefit from this training, Sarah replied. The goal is to create a network of Federation military personnel who understand human tactical principles and can apply them when situations require unconventional approaches. But, initially, Colonel Santos emphasized, we just want to make sure that someone besides humans understands how to counter the tactical approaches that hostile factions are already using against us. The logic was compelling, but Zethkar had to consider the potential consequences for his career if such activities were discovered by Federation military command. On the other hand, the alternative might be finding himself in command of forces that were completely unprepared for the kind of warfare that seemed to be developing along Federation borders. These hostile factions you mentioned, he said, how sophisticated are their tactical capabilities? Lieutenant Parker pulled up intercepted communications and tactical analysis from recent border incidents. They're using multi-layered deception operations, coordinated psychological warfare, and systematic exploitation of Federation response protocols. This isn't random raiding. It's carefully planned strategic probing designed to map our weaknesses. And they're getting more aggressive, Commander Martinez added. Each incident tests Federation capabilities in different areas. They're methodically identifying gaps in our defenses and response capabilities. Colonel Santos highlighted specific tactical patterns in the enemy operations. The sophistication level suggests they have access to detailed intelligence about Federation military doctrine, possibly including access to our own tactical manuals and training materials. Meaning they know exactly how we'll respond to various threat scenarios, Zethkar concluded. Precisely, which gives them enormous tactical advantages as long as Federation forces continue to follow predictable response patterns. Sarah brought up additional data showing Federation casualties from recent engagements. The numbers are still low, but the trend is troubling. Each incident results in higher Federation losses and more successful enemy operations. Because we're not adapting our tactics to counter their innovations, Lieutenant Parker observed. Federation military doctrine assumes that superior technology and established procedures will be sufficient to handle any threat. Human military philosophy assumes the opposite, Colonel Santos said. We expect enemies to learn and adapt, so we emphasize flexibility and tactical innovation rather than relying on standardized responses. Zethkar found himself convinced both by the evidence and by the logical framework the humans were presenting. Federation military preparation was indeed inadequate for the kind of threats that seemed to be emerging, and human tactical knowledge offered clear advantages in addressing those threats. I'll participate in your training program, he said finally. But I want to understand exactly what I'm committing to. Sarah smiled with what appeared to be genuine relief. Honestly, we weren't sure if any non-human officers would be willing to seriously engage with human military concepts. Previous attempts to share this knowledge haven't gone well, Commander Martinez explained. Most galactic military officers find human tactical approaches either incomprehensible or offensive to their cultural values. But recent events suggest that cultural preferences may be less important than tactical effectiveness, Colonel Santos observed. The universe doesn't care whether our military doctrine is elegant or honors traditional values. It only cares whether we can defend ourselves effectively. Lieutenant Parker handed Zethkar a data chip containing what appeared to be extensive training materials. This covers the first phase of instruction: basic human military philosophy, historical case studies, and tactical problem-solving exercises. How many officers are currently involved in this program? You'll be the first non-human participant, Sarah admitted. We wanted to test the training approach with someone we knew was intellectually capable of grasping the concepts before expanding to a larger group. The responsibility was both flattering and intimidating. Zethkar would essentially be a proof of concept for whether human military knowledge could be effectively transferred to other species. When do we begin? Immediately, Colonel Santos replied. Intelligence reports suggest we may have weeks rather than months before these border-probing activities escalate into something more serious. As the meeting concluded, Zethkar realized that his military education was about to become far more intensive and practically relevant than anything offered in the Academy's official curriculum. The humans had just offered him access to strategic knowledge that could revolutionize his understanding of warfare and military leadership. More importantly, they had identified a genuine strategic threat that Federation military establishment was apparently unable or unwilling to address through normal channels. The unofficial training program wasn't just an academic exercise. It might be the difference between Federation forces being prepared or unprepared for a new kind of warfare. Walking back to his quarters with the training materials, Zethkar felt both excitement and apprehension about what he was about to learn. Human military philosophy promised to be as challenging to his preconceptions as Sarah's classroom presentation had been, but potentially far more consequential for the future of Federation security. 3 months into the unofficial training program, Zethkar barely recognized his own tactical thinking. The human military education had systematically deconstructed every assumption he'd held about warfare, strategy, and command decisions. What had begun as academic curiosity had evolved into a fundamental transformation of his approach to military problems. The morning's exercise involved analyzing a simulated border crisis using both traditional Federation response protocols and human tactical alternatives. Zethkar studied the scenario parameters. A hostile force had seized a mining facility in a disputed system, taken civilian hostages, and demanded territorial concessions. Standard Federation doctrine called for a measured response involving diplomatic negotiations backed by overwhelming military force. Standard approach fails, he announced to the small group of officers who had quietly joined the training program over the past month. The scenario is designed to exploit Federation predictability. Lieutenant Commander Kron, a Centauri engineer who had proven surprisingly adept at human tactical concepts, nodded agreement. The hostage situation prevents immediate military response, allowing the enemy to consolidate their position and prepare for Federation countermeasures. Worse, added Captain Tvek, a Vulcanoid strategic planning officer, the diplomatic timeline gives them opportunity to establish permanent fortifications and bring in reinforcements. Sarah Chun, now serving as their primary instructor, gestured for Zethkar to continue his analysis. What would human tactical doctrine suggest? Ignore the apparent scenario, Zethkar replied without hesitation. The mining facility seizure is misdirection. The real objective is to force Federation forces to commit to a predictable response pattern in this location. He activated the holographic display to highlight system-wide sensor data. While Federation attention focuses on the hostage crisis, enemy forces are conducting reconnaissance throughout the sector. They're mapping our response capabilities, defensive positions, and logistical networks. So the hostages are irrelevant? Kron asked. The hostages are a tactical constraint designed to limit Federation options, Zethkar corrected. But human doctrine emphasizes attacking enemy strategy rather than reacting to their tactical moves. Captain Tvek studied the display thoughtfully. What would constitute an attack on their strategy? We need to identify what they actually hope to achieve, Sarah interjected. The mining facility has minimal strategic value, but its location provides excellent sensor coverage of 3 major shipping lanes and 2 Federation naval patrol routes. Zethkar highlighted those routes on the display. They're not trying to hold territory. They're gathering intelligence for a larger operation that will target Federation logistics and naval movements. Which means the appropriate response is to feed them false intelligence rather than attempting to retake the facility, Kron concluded. Exactly. Let them maintain their observation post while we control what they observe. Use their reconnaissance effort against them by allowing them to gather carefully prepared misinformation about Federation capabilities and response patterns. The analysis represented exactly the kind of thinking that human training had made possible. Instead of reacting to enemy actions, they were focusing on enemy intentions and finding ways to turn enemy strengths into vulnerabilities. Sarah nodded approvingly. Now, how would you implement this approach without violating Federation military regulations? The question highlighted the ongoing challenge of applying human tactical principles within Federation institutional constraints. Official military doctrine didn't recognize concepts like strategic deception or deliberate misinformation campaigns. Submit a standard hostage rescue proposal through normal channels, Captain Tvek suggested. Meanwhile, implement the intelligence deception operation as a parallel security enhancement initiative. The rescue operation becomes cover for the real strategy, Zethkar agreed. Federation bureaucracy requires us to address the apparent threat, but nothing prevents us from addressing the actual threat simultaneously. Lieutenant Commander Kron pulled up relevant regulations. Sensor network modifications and patrol route adjustments can be implemented under existing security protocols without requiring special authorization. The solution was elegant and demonstrated how human tactical thinking could be adapted to work within Federation institutional structures. The key was understanding that official procedures could be used as camouflage for more sophisticated strategic operations. This approach has broader implications, Sarah observed. If enemy forces are conducting systematic intelligence gathering operations throughout Federation territory, then this incident represents a pattern rather than an isolated event. Zethkar accessed border security reports from the past 6 months, applying pattern recognition techniques that human training had taught him to use. What emerged was a comprehensive picture of coordinated enemy reconnaissance that Federation intelligence had completely missed. 17 separate incidents, he announced. Each one appeared to be random aggression or territorial probing. But the geographic pattern reveals systematic intelligence gathering focused on Federation military logistics and response capabilities. Captain Tvek cross-referenced the incident locations with Federation supply routes and strategic assets. They're mapping our entire military infrastructure. Every major logistical node, communication relay, and naval base has been scouted within the past year. Which means they're preparing for a large-scale operation that will target Federation military infrastructure rather than engaging in conventional fleet battles, Kron concluded. The implications were staggering. Federation forces were preparing for traditional space warfare, while potential enemies were planning to attack the logistics and communication systems that made Federation military operations possible. We need to brief Federation military command immediately, Captain Tvek said. Sarah exchanged glances with Zethkar before responding. Previous attempts to share strategic intelligence derived from human analytical methods have not been well received by senior Federation officers. What do you mean? Human pattern recognition and strategic analysis often identify threats that conventional intelligence methods miss, Zethkar explained. When human officers have tried to share such analysis, they've been told that their methods are unreliable or that they're seeing patterns that don't actually exist. Lieutenant Commander Kron looked incredulous. Even when subsequent events prove their analysis correct? Especially then, Sarah replied grimly. Accurate predictions that contradict official assessments are seen as threatening to institutional credibility rather than valuable intelligence contributions. The group fell silent as they absorbed this information. They had just identified what appeared to be evidence of a major enemy operation targeting Federation military infrastructure. But the institutional resistance to human analytical methods meant that their findings might be dismissed regardless of their accuracy. "What do you suggest we do?" Captain Tvek asked. "Document everything thoroughly," Zethkar replied. "Continue developing countermeasures based on human tactical principles. When the enemy operation begins, we'll be positioned to respond effectively even if official channels fail to recognize the threat. And hope that Federation Military Command learns to value human strategic contributions before it's too late," Kron added. Sarah activated a new set of training materials focused on defensive operations and counterintelligence methods. "Let's continue with scenarios that address infrastructure protection and logistic security. If our analysis is correct, these skills will become very relevant very soon." Over the following weeks, the training program evolved from theoretical exercises into practical preparation for potential crisis situations. The small group of officers found themselves developing contingency plans and response protocols that went far beyond anything covered in official Federation military curriculum. Zethkar discovered that human military education emphasized preparation for unpredictable threats rather than training for specific scenarios. Instead of memorizing response procedures, they learned analytical frameworks that could be applied to any strategic situation. "The most important lesson," Sarah explained during one session, "is that enemies will always try to fight you on terms that favor their strengths and exploit your weaknesses. The goal is to recognize what kind of conflict they're trying to create and then force them to fight a different kind of war instead." Captain Tvek found this concept particularly challenging. Vulcanoid military tradition emphasizes logical analysis and optimal responses to given situations. The idea of deliberately changing the nature of a conflict seems almost irrational. "It's not irrational," Kron protested. "It's strategic thinking at a higher level. Instead of accepting the enemy's definition of what the conflict is about, you impose your own definition." "Exactly," Zethkar agreed. "Human military philosophy treats the rules of engagement as variables to be controlled rather than fixed parameters to be worked within." The discussion highlighted how human tactical thinking differed from every other military tradition they had encountered. While most species focused on optimizing their performance within established frameworks, humans focused on changing the frameworks themselves to create advantages. Which explains why Federation military doctrine is vulnerable to human-style tactical approaches, Sarah observed. "Our enemies have learned to think like humans about warfare, while our own forces continue to think in terms of conventional galactic military traditions." As their training progressed, the group began developing specific recommendations for improving Federation military preparedness. However, implementing these recommendations would require overcoming institutional resistance that had proven remarkably persistent. "We need allies within Federation military command," Captain Tvek suggested. "Senior officers who would be willing to consider unconventional approaches if presented properly." Zethkar had been thinking about this problem extensively. The key is finding officers whose career advancement doesn't depend on defending current doctrine. People who would benefit from being associated with innovative strategic thinking. Junior officers with ambition and senior officers near retirement, Kron suggested. Groups that have less investment in maintaining existing policies. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. And officers who have had direct experience with the kind of tactical problems we've been studying. People who have seen conventional approaches fail and would be open to alternatives. The conversation was interrupted by an urgent communication alert. Captain Tvek accessed his command console and immediately became very serious. "Border incident in Sector 7. Enemy forces have seized a Federation communications relay and are demanding territorial negotiations." Zethkar felt a chill of recognition. Sector 7 communications relay provides oversight for supply routes to 4 different Federation naval bases. "This fits the pattern we identified," Kron observed grimly. "They're moving from intelligence gathering to active disruption of Federation military infrastructure." Sarah was already pulling up tactical analysis protocols. "This may be the beginning of the large-scale operation we predicted. The question is whether Federation military command will recognize what's really happening." As alarms began sounding throughout the academy and emergency protocols activated, Zethkar realized that their unofficial training program was about to face its first real-world test. The strategic concepts they had learned would either prove their value in actual crisis conditions or demonstrate that human military philosophy was simply another theoretical framework with limited practical application. The next few hours would determine whether months of intensive education had prepared them to handle threats that conventional Federation military doctrine couldn't address, or whether they had simply convinced themselves that they understood strategic realities that were more complex than they realized. What was certain was that the border crisis represented exactly the kind of situation where human tactical thinking offered clear advantages over traditional Federation approaches, assuming they could find ways to apply their knowledge without violating institutional constraints that might prevent effective response to an evolving threat. The crisis escalated exactly as human tactical analysis had predicted. Within 18 hours of the initial communications relay seizure, enemy forces struck simultaneously at 7 additional Federation infrastructure targets across 3 sectors. Supply depots were bombed, communication networks were disrupted, and patrol routes were systematically ambushed by forces that seemed to know exactly where Federation vessels would be at specific times. Zethkar stood in the Academy's Emergency Command Center, watching Federation military command struggle to respond to a type of warfare they had never seriously prepared for. Traditional response protocols called for immediate counterattacks against enemy positions, but the targets were either empty by the time Federation forces arrived or had been booby-trapped with devastating effectiveness. "Sir, Admiral Kforth requests your immediate presence in the strategic planning briefing," announced a young communications officer. Zethkar felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. Admiral Kforth commanded Federation forces in this sector and was known for his orthodox approach to military problems. The likelihood that he would be receptive to unconventional tactical suggestions was minimal, but the rapidly deteriorating situation might create opportunities for new approaches. The briefing room was filled with senior Federation officers representing every major species in the military hierarchy. Admiral Kforth, a massively built Tellarite with an impressive service record, dominated the central planning table where holographic displays showed the scope of enemy operations. "Gentlemen," the Admiral began, "we are facing a coordinated attack on Federation military infrastructure. Enemy forces are using terrorist tactics to avoid direct confrontation while systematically degrading our operational capabilities." Zethkar noted the language immediately. By categorizing enemy actions as terrorism rather than strategy, Admiral Kforth was revealing his fundamental misunderstanding of what was happening. The enemy wasn't avoiding confrontation out of fear. They were imposing a type of warfare that favored their capabilities over Federation strengths. Recommended response is immediate retaliation against known enemy bases and supply facilities, continued the Admiral. We will demonstrate that terrorist tactics cannot succeed against Federation military superiority. Captain Mrek, a Centauri intelligence officer, raised a tentative objection. "Sir, intelligence analysis suggests that the targets being attacked were chosen for their strategic value rather than symbolic impact. This appears to be systematic infrastructure degradation rather than random terrorism." "Captain, enemy motivations are irrelevant," Admiral Kforth replied curtly. "Federation doctrine is clear. Respond to aggression with overwhelming force applied against enemy military assets." Zethkar recognized the moment that human training had prepared him for. The official response would not only fail to address the actual threat, but would likely make the situation worse by playing into enemy tactical planning. The question was whether he could find a way to introduce alternative approaches without directly challenging Admiral Kforth's authority. "Admiral," Zethkar said carefully, "might I suggest a parallel intelligence operation to identify how enemy forces obtain such detailed knowledge of our infrastructure vulnerabilities?" "What do you mean?" "The timing and coordination of these attacks suggests enemy access to classified information about Federation logistics, patrol schedules, and facility security protocols. Identifying the source of this intelligence leak should be a priority alongside direct military response." Admiral Kforth considered this for a moment. "Captain Mrek, what is the status of counterintelligence investigations?" "Sir, Preliminary analysis indicates that enemy forces possessed detailed knowledge of Federation military procedures that could only have been obtained through extensive observation and analysis of our operations. Zethkar saw his opening. This suggests enemy intelligence capabilities far more sophisticated than random terrorist groups typically possess. We may be dealing with a state-level actor employing professional military intelligence services. Your point, Commander? If this is a professional military operation rather than terrorist activity, then our response should be calibrated to counter their strategic objectives rather than simply retaliating for their tactical actions. The distinction was subtle but crucial. By reframing the situation as professional warfare rather than terrorism, Zethkar was creating space for strategic thinking rather than purely reactive responses. Captain Mrek supported the analysis. Intelligence patterns do suggest systematic strategic planning rather than opportunistic attacks. Enemy forces appear to be implementing a coordinated campaign designed to degrade specific Federation military capabilities. What capabilities? Admiral Kforth demanded. Zethkar activated the tactical display and highlighted the affected systems: logistics coordination, communication networks, and patrol predictability. They're creating gaps in our ability to respond rapidly and effectively to threats in multiple locations simultaneously, which suggests they're preparing for a larger operation that will exploit those gaps, Captain Mrek concluded. The briefing room fell silent as senior officers absorbed the implications. If the current attacks were preparatory rather than primary objectives, then Federation forces were facing a much more serious threat than anyone had initially realized. Recommendations? Admiral Kforth asked. We need to assume that enemy intelligence about our operations is comprehensive and current, Zethkar replied. Standard response protocols should be modified to account for enemy knowledge of our typical procedures, meaning unpredictable patrol routes, altered communication protocols, and logistical procedures that don't follow established patterns. Make it impossible for enemy forces to anticipate our actions based on previous observations. Admiral Kforth looked skeptical. You're suggesting we abandon proven operational procedures in favor of random improvisation? Not random, Zethkar corrected. Deliberately unpredictable. There are tactical methodologies for maintaining operational effectiveness while denying enemies the ability to predict our actions. What kind of methodologies? Zethkar took a deep breath, realizing he was about to introduce human tactical concepts to Federation military command for the first time. Asymmetric warfare doctrine developed by species with extensive experience in fighting technologically superior opponents. Which species? Humans, sir. They have several thousand years of experience with exactly this type of strategic situation. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Several officers exchanged skeptical glances, while others looked openly dismissive. Admiral Kforth's expression suggested he considered the suggestion mildly insulting. Commander, human military experience consists primarily of primitive planetary conflicts using obsolete technology. I fail to see how such knowledge could be relevant to modern space warfare. Zethkar had anticipated this response and prepared accordingly. Sir, with respect, human tactical principles were successfully employed by Federation forces at the Battle of Kepler's Edge. Lieutenant Commander Santos used adapted human strategies to achieve one of the most decisive victories in Federation naval history. Santos was implementing Admiral Karash's strategic directives. Admiral Kforth replied automatically. Actually, sir, Admiral Karash was unconscious in medical bay during the entire engagement. Santos was operating independently using tactical approaches derived from human military history. The statement created a stir throughout the briefing room. Captain Mrek was already accessing archived records, while other officers looked between Admiral Kforth and Zethkar with obvious uncertainty. That is not consistent with official historical accounts, the Admiral said slowly. No, sir, it isn't. But it is consistent with primary source medical logs, ship sensor records, and Lieutenant Commander Santos's own tactical reports. Captain Mrek looked up from his data search. Sir, Commander Zethkar appears to be correct about Admiral Karash's medical status during the battle. The archived logs do show him in surgery for the entire engagement period. Admiral Kvorth was clearly struggling to process information that contradicted fundamental assumptions about one of Federation military history's most celebrated victories. Even if that were true, how would it be relevant to our current situation? Because enemy forces are currently employing the same tactical approaches that Santos used at Kepler's Edge, Zethkar replied. They're avoiding direct confrontation, using superior intelligence to achieve tactical surprise, and focusing on systemic vulnerabilities rather than military strengths. You're saying that our enemies learned human warfare tactics? I'm saying that human warfare tactics are effective against conventional Federation military doctrine, and our enemies have apparently recognized this fact. The implication hung in the air like an unexploded ordnance. If enemy forces were using human tactical approaches, then Federation success would require either superior implementation of the same approaches or development of effective counters to human warfare doctrine. What specifically do you recommend? Admiral Kvorth asked finally. Immediate consultation with human military advisors who understand both the tactical approaches being used against us and effective countermeasures, Zethkar replied. We need to understand the strategic framework behind these attacks, not just respond to individual incidents. Captain Reck supported the recommendation. Sir, if we're facing professional military intelligence services employing sophisticated tactical doctrine, then our response needs to be equally sophisticated. Admiral Kvorth was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing political considerations against military necessities. Finally, he activated his command console. Colonel Santos, please report to strategic planning immediately. Zethkar felt a surge of satisfaction. Colonel Santos had been quietly stationed at the academy for months, officially assigned to logistics coordination, but actually serving as senior advisor to the unofficial human military training program. When Colonel Santos entered the briefing room, his presence immediately changed the atmosphere. Unlike other human officers who typically maintained differential attitudes around senior Federation commanders, Santos carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had been making life and death strategic decisions for decades. Colonel, Admiral Kvorth said, Commander Zethkar believes that current enemy operations are employing human military tactics. Can you confirm or refute this assessment? Colonel Santos studied the tactical displays for several minutes before responding. The operational pattern is consistent with systematic infrastructure degradation designed to create multiple simultaneous crisis situations that will overwhelm conventional response capabilities. It's a textbook implementation of distributed asymmetric warfare, meaning they're not trying to destroy Federation military forces directly. They're creating conditions where Federation forces will be unable to function effectively even if they remain technically intact. Admiral Kvorth looked grim. Effective countermeasures? Depends on how committed the Federation is to departing from standard operational procedures, Colonel Santos replied. Countering asymmetric warfare requires asymmetric responses. Explain. Stop trying to protect everything and start making the enemy worry about protecting their own assets. Shift from defensive reactions to offensive initiatives. Force them to respond to our actions instead of continuing to react to theirs. The recommendation was exactly what human tactical training had suggested, but hearing it from Colonel Santos gave it authority that Zethkar could never have provided. More importantly, it offered Admiral Kvorth a path toward regaining initiative in a deteriorating strategic situation. Specific recommendations? The Admiral asked. Give me operational command of a small task force and authorization to implement non-standard tactical approaches, Colonel Santos replied. I'll demonstrate effective countermeasures to current enemy operations. Admiral Kvorth considered the request carefully. What kind of non-standard approaches? The kind that will solve your immediate problems and prevent similar attacks in the future. The non-answer was obviously deliberate, but Admiral Kvorth was under enough pressure that he approved the request anyway. Colonel Santos, you have command of Task Force 7 with full authorization for tactical innovation. Commander Zethkar will serve as your liaison with Federation Strategic Command. As the briefing concluded, Zethkar realized that human military knowledge was finally being given the opportunity to prove its value under actual combat conditions. The unofficial training program had succeeded in creating conditions where human tactical innovation could be applied to real Federation military problems. More importantly, the crisis had forced Federation military command to acknowledge that conventional approaches were insufficient for dealing with sophisticated enemy operations. The institutional resistance to human military concepts was being overcome by strategic necessity. Colonel Santos approached Zethkar as other officers filed out of the briefing room. "Commander, I hope you understand what we're about to attempt. This will be the first official application of human tactical doctrine by Federation forces." "I understand the significance," Zethkar replied, "and the risks if we fail." "We won't fail," Colonel Santos said with quiet confidence. Human military approaches work because they're based on several thousand years of practical experience. The question isn't whether our tactics are effective, it's whether Federation institutional culture can adapt to strategic realities. As they left the briefing room to begin planning the first official human-led military operation in Federation history, Zethkar reflected on how completely his understanding of warfare had been transformed. The small human who had embarrassed him in class had introduced him to a way of thinking about conflict that was about to reshape Federation military doctrine permanently. The real battle was just beginning. But, for the first time since the crisis started, Zethkar felt confident that Federation forces would not only survive but would emerge stronger and more capable than ever before. Human military knowledge was no longer a theoretical curiosity. It was about to become the foundation for a new kind of galactic security doctrine.